All right, man.
Hello. You'd think after however long I would have realized that you need to unmute yourself.
But, I haven't unmuted myself.
No, I've unmuted myself now. So now you're probably going to go mute yourself. Yes. Sorry. So I had put the recording for the third one. I put it on my computer, so I uploaded it. So sorry, I just replied to your email.
Okay. Yeah.
I was a bit
problem.
behind on things. So yeah. But yeah, I did talk to somebody the other day. I need to also follow up on that about some sort of lasagna financing concept. So if you want to dive right into what lasagna financing is and how
Absolutely. Do you realize that lasagna is my favorite food?
Wow. I feel like there's a Garfield meme required here.
Well, actually, I was watching. I mean, it's very side note, but I was watching the second or third episode of Will Arnett's that animation series of the horse, BoJack Horseman. Have you ever watched that?
Oh, okay. Yes, I've never watched it, but I've heard the name. Yes.
My son got me into it. And so we watched the whole series as like this father-son bonding thing. It was actually really cool because, Will Arnett makes this kind of like dark, like animation sort of thing. Right. And
wait, how old's your son? I'm concerned now.
Yeah. He's 17.
Oh, wow. Okay. So he's not 18 yet. So you still need to shield him from keep all those good Christian morals and stuff that you.
Well, and I will say, like it does get a little uncomfortable. Like the thing that there's this like horse, and he picks up this girl from the bar, and there's a scene of them, doing it in a cartoon fashion, right?
And he's a horse.
And he's a horse.
Wait, is the top, or is it a centaur? Like I haven't seen the show.
He functions as a human, right? Like he functions like he just happens to be like one of us. He's just a horse, and he talks, and he's like, yeah, I'm horse,
there's an obvious joke there, right?
Well, anyway. I know, because it can get really dark, but
and really dirty, right?
Really dark and really dirty and stuff but
with cartoons, dirty. There was this guy in the 80s or 90s or whatever, Reg Hart. Did you ever hear of this guy? He was in Toronto. He used to have these old film canisters, like literal, like whatever 8mm film of Bugs Bunny and stuff, and he'd have all these posters around. And is like, come to like see dirty Bugs Bunny films or whatever. And apparently, like his shtick was like he had all these old film canisters or whatever, and these were supposed to be like, Bugs Bunny wasn't created to be a kid's thing. It was actually created for like doctors and like lawyers and stuff who had lots of money and they could watch Bugs Bunny. And so he had some films of like Bugs Bunny, doing obscene things or whatever. Which back then, like you would believe this was true, right? Like maybe he just doctored them. I have no idea, but like maybe they were true. But now you just be like, oh, obviously that was fake, right?
Yeah. Where's the carrot? Well, bend over and I'll show you.
There you go. Right? You go.
Yeah.
That BoJack Horseman to Bugs Bunny.
Yeah. Okay. Where did we start? How did we get pulled down to the BoJack?
Well, we started talking about anything, media.
Lasagna financing. Yeah.
Lasagna.
So I totally missed that. I was like, there's the one episode he's talking about, the character's name's Garfield, and they just ham it up where they're like, his favorite food is lasagna, and he hates Mondays, and like all this kind of stuff, right?
There you go. I have invited somebody by the name of Michael Garfield to appear on this. I do need to schedule it and stuff like that, which like, if you know me, that's going to be the hardest part of the whole thing, is actually trying to figure out how to get somebody to commit to a specific date and time and just make sure that all happens. I'm sure he will. He seems amazing. But his last name is Garfield. So, maybe if we talk about lasagna financing and he sees this episode, he'll be like all in on doing this stuff. But he's from the Santa Fe Institute, so I'm sort of concerned that like we're gonna like damage his reputation, and then like that'll be it, right? That'll be like, he used to be involved in the Santa Fe Institute, but he appeared on leading into Stupididy. Nice spelling, by the way. I still love that. And that was the end. I have gone out of my way now. I don't know if I told you this story, but like now that I meet with people every now and then, I go out of my way to tell them that my first job out of when I graduated was working at Nortel. And like I went to U of T and I was 10 minutes late to every meeting because that's what you learn going to U of T. And Nortel went bankrupt. So it's this nice story that like encapsulates me just like destroying things just everywhere I go, like just leaning into chaos. Not only stupidity, but also chaos. And do we talk about D&D alignment, like chaotic good, chaotic evil?
We did.
Chaotic stupid. So
We did, and I'm your humble like apprentice here because
Yes.
I don't know D&D other than
you have those weird dice.
the
Multiple.
Astragula,
Yeah, which is like the weirdest thing to have and not be into D&D.
Yeah. Or what I would say is that why doesn't D&D somehow embrace that as like the master die? You know what I mean?
Maybe it does. I haven't played in many years. Maybe it does.
Yeah.
The D20 was sort of the big thing, the 20-sided die. I don't know if you ever watched Stranger Things, because they kind of went into the Dungeons and Dragons sort of world of things. It was set in the early 80s, so that made sense.
All sorts of
lore. Yeah. So the lasagna financing idea. So this relates to what we were talking about last week with construction and so on and so forth. So I met with somebody and they run a fund. And what they do with that fund is they get a combination of investor money, like for profit, and then, government sort of financing and land and like whatever else they can do. And the point is really that they put layers of different, financing. So some of it's, for profit, some of it not for profit, subsidy, whatever. And then you make lasagna out of that. And you put the tasty sauce on and whatever. I don't know how you make lasagna, ricotta cheese, something like that, whatever. But the idea is you sort of do this mix, and then that way everybody kind of gets what they want. The government gets affordable housing, and then the investor gets like a risk-adjusted return that's like, somewhat comparable. Obviously this is, risky stuff. It's only open to accredited investors kind of stuff. So it's like, well, maybe you have a small percentage of your portfolio on this because you want some exposure to real estate because there's some inflation protection, blah, 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 blah. And if you're like, thinking of buying any sort of like real estate investment, of your own out there, like an actual piece of property, like that's, I don't know, in Vancouver, it's like probably $7 million to buy like a condo or whatever it is. Like seriously, it's like $1 million. Like what do they cost?
Yeah, it's approaching it. Well, I think probably like entry level condos are about 700,000. So they're high. And downtown Toronto was maybe there was in like a short little surplus on the market. I was involved in the tower business. In fact, with a Toronto-based company for a couple of years, and and I've been to Toronto many times, right? But that skyline, there's lots of towers that were put up really quickly. And I like to think that it helped solve the market, but I don't know if the shorting.
No. The challenge is that like you do actually have to keep building more and more and more and more. And so like the anti-immigration folks, like they are somewhat correct in that like if you cut off our supply of immigration, then like maybe you don't have to keep building more and more and more houses. But like, is that really the solution? Like, let's do that. And then what are the other effects? Like what effect does that have on like, GDP and so on and so forth, right? Like, and distribution of wealth and stuff. Thomas Piketty did actually write about this in his seminal work, Capital of the 21st Century, and basically pointed out you want a growth rate higher than the rate of interest. And then that sort of drives towards, more equality and stuff like that. And one of the things that creates a growth rate higher than interest is high immigration or whatever. So there are some reasonably good arguments for like immigration can be a good thing for like, the general population and stuff. You do actually need to sell it to people and not just like point to somebody's like 500-page book about it.
So I'm going to give you an option here. Which way would you like? What's more intuitive for you to take the conversation?
Oh, wow. The only answer is just pick the two options and then roll the astragula and we'll see what happens.
Okay, we'll try and do that. Okay, so so the one option is to talk about the GDP and let's just use words to exaggerate the point, like our obsession on GDP. Okay. Okay, and then the other approach would be the fundamental divide between liberal and conservative.
Ooh, wow.
On these,
I kind of want to do both, but let's let the astragula decide.
Yeah, let's let the astragula decide. But here's the thing, because we have an ability to make, and I can't draw on it as of like in 2 minutes, and I don't want to bring out the Sharpie. So there's an 80-20, right? So you've got a big side and a small side times 2. So which side is going to be the big side and which side is going to be the small side? Which is the 20% ratio and which is the 40% ratio?
Wow. Well, yeah, 80-20, that's perfect for an economic discussion, right?
Pareto.
So I'm not sure which one deserves the 80, but I'd say let's roll the die to find out. But that doesn't work either, does it? Because we already have the.
Which one's more ubiquitous? I think one thing that is that transcends political lines, right? Is the GDP.
Yeah, so, I think that might be more worth. Like liberal conservative, sort of boring, and like we can talk about that. But GDP, I would be curious. So you're all 80%. In, like GDP is totally the thing we should have lots and lots of, is what you're saying, right?
No, actually, quite the opposite. But that's why it'll make an interesting discussion. Yeah.
Well, I kind of don't want to roll the die, but let's roll the die and find out what happens. See if we get the 80% for the GDP.
Okay,
the 20% for the other thing.
There it is. It's we're right in that Pareto ratio. So it's the GDP talk. Okay.
Right. So yes, let's hear the. I don't know.
Let me roll up my sleeves to stupidity here. Okay. There we go. I'm fully exercising, my right to be stupid here.
Yes. Embrace it. Yes. GDP is bad because, or how do you want to frame it? Like,
I want to say that, in every point in human history, there's been something that we worship. And there's buildings that populate skylines that will attest to the fact that finance, insurance companies, banks are the biggest and the most powerful institutions in our civilization as we know it right now. Right? Okay. Finance sector, insurance companies, they're the ones that have the tallest buildings. Right? There's an academic that brought that up. There's a point in history where the biggest buildings were churches, and they were, the entities that had the most power. So anyways, with modern economics, you're absolutely right. Whether pretty much no matter what side you're on, GDP is the god, right? It is the level of prosperity. So when I look at, when we look at Canada and we try and report to other nations, and we even report to that's the easiest way to say it. We report to other nations, and how is our prosperity in relation to their prosperity, right? And so when we have a healthy GDP, this means economically we're doing well, okay? My issue, and this is where we might immediately start to fall into a divide, is that well, because I'm a big climate change guy, right? And I see this, not as a liberal takeover or any of this kind of stuff. I'm saying we need to change how we consume, and so what that means is that what's the value of you and I doing a show like this?
Well, we should ask our 3 listeners.
Right. But are we contributing to GDP by, producing a show like this? Right. Are we, we're producing something, right? But we're not actually producing
it. So if you convince people of what you're saying, we were actually going to take GDP down. But if I convince people of what I'm saying, we're going to take it up. So maybe. Right, okay. It depends on the 3 people watching and where they're already at, and sort of the marginal contribution of each of our topics. But so I think there is the idea that maybe GDP doesn't capture everything. It doesn't capture the right things. It's kind of somehow, some way flawed. I think that's reasonably sensible. I think RFK or JFK. I would look it up, but this is a show about stupidity. So a Kennedy.
We don't really look shit up, right?
Exactly. Back in the 60s or whatever said
the smart people look the shit up.
Exactly.
If you want to be stupid about it, you just spurt off whatever.
You just spurt off. Right? So somebody back in the 60s who's probably a Kennedy, but it doesn't really matter who it was, because the point was they said GDP measures, measures a lot of things that, are sort of bad. Like if somebody, gets hurt and has to go to the hospital, then that gets captured in GDP. And it doesn't capture things like, loving your children, or, maybe more to your point, like how does the climate get reflected in GDP, right? For lumber, that's GDP, the tree that's still standing in the forest and growing, who speaks for the trees? Like, obviously we know it's the Lorax, but who's paying big Lorax, right? Like, like that's like if you follow the money, it leads you back to the GDP, right? So it's kind of the idea that if you say, oh, GDP is important, then you do bias things in terms of like finance and banks and insurance, right? Because that's kind of, who's got the money. So I don't,
Look, this is nothing. This would be. I wouldn't expect that. I would say, hey, wait a minute. Let's conceptualize the GDP and equivocate it to a modern version of God and say that's what we subconsciously worship as a society. This is the zeitgeist that we're moving towards because we are production centric. We are a society that produces things, right? And that's the point. That's the point as a philosopher, as I'm saying.
I like this. I like this because this does have God in it in terms of like the Protestant work ethic, right? Like,
yeah.
So let's work and produce things, and that'll get us closer to God, right? And that, yet again, we'd look up who it is, but like, let's say it was, I don't know, somebody, Max Weber, who probably wrote this. The
Max Weber, he's I really go to back as a Max Weber, the father of psychology, right?
Yeah, and he makes an amazing barbecue grill.
I've never heard about this. I want to hear about this.
The Weber grill is a Canadian classic type grill. I don't know if you don't have them in Vancouver. Maybe it's because maybe people don't barbecue because they're environmentally friendly out there.
Well, but wait, I mean, I never knew the connection, but
there isn't one. Who knows? Maybe there is. Maybe it's like some long lost,
No, but what he's famous for? One of the things that he's famous for is measuring like differences in sensations, right? So if I had two objects in my hand of equal weight, and if I changed, say, this one, right, and I made it lighter and lighter and lighter and lighter and lighter, my hand wouldn't go down, but I make it lighter.
The physics is getting confused here.
Yeah. So I make it lighter, but we can't notice. Like our perceptions, and this is the point that he's actually measuring where our perception fall off is on sensation. So even though it is empirically less weight, one versus the other, there's a sensation that we can't tell the difference between the two, right? Our sensations don't match the empirical measurements. And so what I really like about Max Weber is that he put basically, he tried to put psychology on an empirical framework. And so I really go to him as opposed to, say, Freud or Jung, right? I just like, come on. Like,
I'm not a big fan of Freud. I think he maybe had some problems with his mother. I don't know. I haven't really read his works. But I think they're all biographical, probably. Don't know the guy. But Jung, I think, is a really great literary critic, more so than a psychologist philosopher, right? Because if you look at any story, it's full of Jungian kind of archetypes and hero's quest and blah, blah, blah. And like it, yeah, it's probably useful. Like if you were like wanted to be a really good writer, or if you had like a platform or you wanted to help people become really good writers, you talk about Carl Jung a lot and have them watch Star Wars and lots of other things. And like this isn't by no means an original idea. Other people have written smarter things than I have. I just repeat basically what I read by Tomas Poyo, who wrote the Why Government Should Shut Down Now with the COVID. He also wrote this amazing series about sort of the use of stories and archetypes and things like that. The guy's amazingly talented. But yeah, I guess the GDP thing is as fascinating because countries like Bhutan have gone down the gross happiness and then wrote. And then I was at this Radical Exchange Open Space Unconference on Friday, which was amazing. And somebody there talked about a concept I'd never heard of before called Buddhist economics. And it was looking at things like Bhutan and looking at alternatives to measure things like connection and happiness. And I think that like it's possible that GDP is insufficient and that maybe if you over prioritize GDP, you can create some things that are bad. But there's this website, Our World in Data, which does an amazing job of like showing data and our world. It's right in the name there. And they have some great series of sort of charts and graphs with GDP showing that like basically Thomas Malthus was right up until he finished writing his work. And then he was wrong because the Industrial Revolution happened, and like you get this hockey stick of growth. And what's fascinating, those of you, if you look sort of by country, they did an amazing series looking at Africa and showing in sub-Saharan Africa, you probably actually do need more GDP there because the wealth needs to be about 8 times, like GDP per capita needs to be about 8 times what it is in Africa for them to sort of drive poverty down to like sort of a reasonable level in terms of like, like it's not like we don't have any poverty in Canada, but it's the sort of thing, it's not like a common experience in, the vast majority of the population. Now, it should be possible in some way to drive poverty down even further. But that's the sort of thing where like the tricky thing with GDP is oftentimes it's sort of the discussion is, well, if we had more GDP, then we could have more social services or whatever. But maybe we get more GDP and it gets eaten up by like, bureaucracy or some inefficiency or something. Or maybe just the GDP growth itself causes more social problems than, the wealth that it creates, right? Like you could go and like clear cut, a whole bunch of trees and be like, hey, we created a bunch of wealth. And it's like, well, what were the trees when they were standing? Those weren't wealth.
Yeah. Alex, it's perfect. You'll bring up very, very good points. Like, I mean, bang on. They're all, I may have an intractable position. I may have something that just completely doesn't, has no legs to stand on, but this is part of the,
well, let's lean into that because I think there's some value in actually having points that are not necessarily popular and not necessarily well supported by data and evidence. And that's the essence of stupidity is in the real value of it is to be like, I have this stupid opinion. I really believe in it really strongly, but then to be able to say like, well, what other stupid opinions could I have, right? Like I could also have a different stupid opinion. Your stupid opinion, I like my stupid opinion. And then we could just leave it there, or we could like try swapping them and seeing like how we feel. But anyway, let me see if I can take on your opinion and see how it feels and what I don't maybe like so much about it. So how would I what would I need to believe? Like, what are the things that sort of form?
So this is a romantic position. This is ideological. This is Platonic in origin, and it relates back to what planksip was starting. So it's highly theoretical. We're talking about planksip as an entity, and I bring planksip up for a particular reason. Small groups work together in interesting ways, and so have I told you about the cooperative and the member competitions that we have for writers?
A little bit. I think there was like 12 or 144. There were some numbers I remember.
That's great that I did. That's great. I
remember two numbers.
I gave a lecture and it was like 12 or 144, something in there. Because
you said small groups. I don't know. And there was a polis of 10,000. So I think if what I remember was correct, and it probably isn't, was that the minimum would be 12 and people would sort of compete and you could win a prize. And you would get a vote, and instead of just voting, you'd get 2 votes. You'd vote for your own, probably, or and then you vote for someone else, or you could use 2 votes on somebody else, and then out of that, presumably somebody sort of wins, and they win some money, which is great. People like money, but this is part of the argument against GDP,
in a way, and it's a long roundabout way of getting there because
let's get there.
So the thing about GDP and in comparison with planksip is I'm trying to change what consumption means. And so from a biological standpoint, from a neurological standpoint, that aha moment, or that almost like the experience that someone does in a shopping mall, the retail therapy, I'd like to go buy something, just for the sake of going to buy something, right? This consumerism really spreads joy, right? We're in the season of it right now. And it doesn't matter. I'm going to buy the dark
shadow of Christmas.
That's right. There's a downside to buying stuff that's going to end up in the landfill in 3 months. Glittery cards, for example. I buy you a card to say Merry Christmas. It's got glitter all over it. It's going to end up it can't be recycled. It's just.
And I buy you a card to say Happy Holidays. And apparently some people that lean into this a lot. But
But I don't mind Christmas. I don't mind.
Oh, okay,
like,
good.
You know,
yeah, I don't mind holidays either. I'm not like fixated on some word choice. Some people weirdly are, but anyway. So to me, that's the dark side of Christmas, or the dark shadow in the Jungian kind of concept of Christmas. Christmas is supposed to be about well, I don't know, peace on earth, goodwill to all peoples, or whatever the modern sort of way of saying it is. You know,
I try and tell that to the 13-year-old. They're like, peace on earth. This is what I mean. Like they don't get the whole big, you know, like the pageantry. Okay, you know, like the beauty pageant. What does the beauty pageant contestant say when she stands up on stage? And hey, I'm not being sexist. I'm saying that's what a beauty pageant was. Like it's like women, beautiful
they
women.
Had these in ancient
the...
Greece, right? They had beauty pageants. They're in ancient, like everything comes from ancient Greece, right? It was like Plato was there.
They did.
And he was like hanging out in his toga and stuff like that, and they're all trying to look hot. You know,
I honestly didn't know if they had a beauty pageant.
They probably don't, but like, why not? Why wouldn't they?
Well,
beauty pageants for the mind. That's planksip is a beauty pageant for the mind.
Ah, that's interesting. And if I lean into it, I'm kind of embracing the whole stupidity of it all, which is fine. I mean, I'm okay with that. I mean, it's really, I mean, hey, you got to make mistakes, right? Or, you know, there's got to be something in there that's or nothing. There doesn't have to be something good in there, but, you know, anyways, I'm trying. But here's the idea is that you have, I'm trying to say that you have a peer supported group that's saying, Alex wrote the best piece on that, right? So Alex gets the money. Now we're all contributing into it, but no one's saying, hey, Alex gets the money and we're deciding and we're the overarching board. This is the whole benefit of something, you know, like self-determined autonomous people, is for us to go out and try and get, like, move up in some sort of a social ascension, right? Move up in our social hierarchy. This is up to me. It's up to you. It's up to everybody to kind of do that. And from a Protestant ethics sort of standpoint, it's up to you to do the work. No one's going to give a shit about what's important to you as much as you. Now, if society says what's important, right, I would say, and this is really a bigger claim for the arts, right? This is to say, look, if GDP and the accelerated rate of production is drawing down resources on our planet that is destructive to our planet, right? Okay, which is kind of an asterisk. We can put that off to the side. You might say it's all a hoax. Nothing's happening, right? There's people as far over on that, or there's people that say, wait a minute, you know, like we can't keep extracting to the level that we are. So I'm saying, why don't we meet somewhere in the middle? Why don't we say, let's just not produce useless shit, right? Like, let's say,
okay,
you know, if I go to a factory and produce worthless shit, that's making me kind of like a useless cog in a wheel just to produce shit for just producing stuff. And
what's fascinating about this is oftentimes you hear the GDP critique coming from people on the left wing. And the left wing's got some great examples of useless factories that produce useless stuff. And it was called like the Soviet Union. And they're great at producing stuff nobody wanted. Like they just excelled at it. And a lot of it was, like you said, it's that top-down stuff. So a market economy does drive towards sort of more of that bottom-up thing. But it also does encourage like people to do like wasteful crap, like glittery cards that they don't actually want because, well, I guess the person who bought it wanted it. They wouldn't have buy it if they didn't want it, but the person they gave it to maybe didn't want it. But then yet again, I think like that when you say retail therapy, it's like there is that sort of dark shadow of Christmas, that this is a stand-in for maybe what Christmas ought to be about. It doesn't have to be like a Christian thing. It could just be a secular, like spend time with your family and like, you know, value and treasure what you already have. And like all those, you know, nice sort of sentiments kind of thing. So yeah, I think I'm probably the world's worst guest at this, at disagreeing with you on things, because I basically agree with you on this. Like, yes, there is a component of GDP which is just worthless crap, and you could sort of give that up and be like, yeah, this would be good. I guess where maybe we disagree is like, to me, the increase in GDP, it tends to be funded not by the worthless crap. It tends to be funded by like you replacing the destructive stuff with better ways of doing things, right? Like if you look at like, you know, if you want to do banking, whatever, 20 years ago or 30 years ago, you'd be going into the branch and be like, this sucks. I have to stand around. Versus a lot of banking now you can do online, which, that is better in some way. I don't know exactly how you pencil that out to GDP, but, the bank maybe, they've got some efficiency, so that's good. And then maybe that frees up some people's time that they can spend on things to do more of that Protestant work ethic and like produce more. So, maybe they're producing more crap people don't need, or perhaps they're making stuff, people actually, sort of value and care about and are willing to spend their hard-earned cash on, right? Like, I don't know, some sort of, I'm trying to think of the most environmentally friendly thing that you could spend your money on, but maybe that's the point. Like the most environmentally friendly thing isn't something you spend your money on.
Yeah, it's from prosperity to austerity, but to do it in a deliberate way is an anathema, right? To anybody who's a libertarian, right? Anybody who feels that growth trajectory is something that is their that's the way to the American dream. That's the way to elevate yourself out of poverty, is to be able to produce something of value for your society. Now, it just happens that our society is based around consumptive, material things. And what I'm saying is that, you said, well, some of the real things that really affect societies are, that really drive GDP are not some of these frivolous things. But let me point to one example that really drives GDP. Cars. Okay.
Cars are the best.
Cars are the best, apparently, right? So yes. Cars, they're great, but it is a function of the market that it's actually moving towards electricity. Now let's lean into some stupidity about that. And this is where maybe it's even an archetypal thing to follow the Jungian thing. It's like eating itself. It's like I've heard that about the left eats itself. So you say, well, we're going to move things over to electric car production. And yet let's really ask the hard question: where do the materials come from? Where do the batteries come from? Where does now we've got not just producing like one people's car, because the Volkswagen, we sound like, hey, here's the car that everybody gets, right? In order to make things more efficient, even if it does burn fossil fuel, we're saying, here's a whole plethora of choices. And now here's a whole nother plethora of choices. Whereas you've actually just increased the industry, right? You've included everything. And so maybe that's the transition phase. But there is irony there, is what I'm saying, is that if you have the electric car, let's not kid yourself. There's a huge carbon footprint to that, right? And I'm not saying that's the only card you say. I don't say, you're being a complete hypocrite, Mr. Environmentalist, but I'm saying you should be aware of the fact that that has an enormous footprint, in a new electric vehicle, right?
Yeah, I think I broadly agree with this concept from like a systems and complexity perspective, to say, like, if you look narrowly at replacing, one type of car with another type of car, you still have all the other infrastructure around it. And that actually is not necessarily all that innovative. It doesn't necessarily improve people's lives in really meaningful ways. Like, what's the difference between being stuck in traffic in a gas powered car versus an electric powered car? Maybe your battery is going to run out sooner in your electric powered car. So maybe you're a bit more anxious and panicked, but sucks being stuck in traffic. Like nobody likes that. So like, maybe the innovative thing would be some sort of road congestion pricing or something, to say like, hey, if you want to go downtown or something, then you actually have to pay like a market rate for using, public roads. And it tends to be most people across both sides of the spectrum absolutely hate the idea of market pricing for public roads. It's like, hey, those are public roads. You can't put a market price on those. But it's weird because as a taxpayer, who do you think's paying for those public roads? Like, they're not cheap to like build and maintain and upgrade and stuff like that. And then I get to just sit waiting around in traffic on them. So I think there is like a broader discussion there in terms of not just the car itself, which you make a good point, like an electric car. It still needs materials. It needs new, different things, lithium batteries, whatever, whole charging infrastructure, all this sort of stuff. But yeah, I don't know if there is a really good incentive though to like start from sort of the beginning of like, what is it that somebody actually needs a car for? And it's like, oh, well, nobody necessarily wants a car all the time, because like once you've driven to your destination, now you have to park the car, and that sucks. So then, like Uber and stuff like that exist. And then it's like, okay, so you have some convenience maybe, but then, you use the Uber and some random person shows up, and like maybe what you really want is like the same car because you like that car, and the same driver because you like that. And then you're sort of moving back to that era of when like people had cars and drivers and stuff like that. And it's like, let's go back 100 years or something.
Alex, it's fizzling. I was like, it had so much steam at the beginning. It had so much momentum.
I know.
And it just went.
But the thing about that is like, what are your other alternatives, right? Like, and part of it is like, why are people traveling so much? Is a question like we don't necessarily really dig into. And it's like, am I traveling so much because I need to or because I want to? And I'd say like given the pandemic, it's been a great experiment into like figuring out that question. And a lot of it is, I think people want to. Like they like the idea of hopping in their car and just driving around for like maybe no actual purpose other than being stuck at home in your basement sucks, and going out for a walk is dangerous because of all the cars out there. So it's like this arms race. Like someone else has a car, I better hop in my car. I have like a little subcompact car. Someone has a bigger car, I better get a bigger car. And then eventually like everybody has big cars, right? So I think like you're really onto something in terms of like the replacing the car replacing the electric car, but it's like even more complicated than just the materials. It's the whole like, what function do cars play? And some of it I think is actually entertainment. Sadly, like cars are a form of entertainment.
Absolutely. And it's nostalgic. The American way is get on the I-5 highway or, Route 66 and just go. And I mean, it was over a decade ago that I got on the highway and a buddy of mine went down to Las Vegas.
There you go.
But Alex, it's like a steady stream. It's not like
it's the road trip, right? Like that's what they talk about, right? Like, it's that, and part of that, maybe if you trace it back further, is sort of like this cultural thing and this evolution thing with like, well, we're sort of meant to go out and like explore and hunt and gather and all that wonderful stuff. And it's like, well, this is our modern way of doing that. Because like, especially the way, like if your neighborhood's built in a certain way, maybe it's kind of like, not all that interesting to walk around your neighborhood. It's much cooler to get into a car and go to someone else's neighborhood or whatever, right? Like, and especially with zoning and stuff, like, the fun stuff that you want to go to is maybe not near where you live. And like there's a whole history. Like Jane Jacobs wrote these amazing books all about this, and like people misinterpreted what she said. But like she writes like a subsequent book where they said like short blocks and then a convenience store, and then they went nuts and put convenience stores, thinking that's what she was. Oh, you want lots of convenience stores? And like, no, that's not what I meant. It's like short blocks are like more walkable and stuff like that. So, so I think like back to your original point with GDP, like there is not like a good way to kind of capture that like. People in the Netherlands, I think, ride bikes a lot. And so it's really, really safe to have a bike there. And it's not like clear to me, and maybe somebody has done some good research into like looking into like, does that actually lead to more capital formation where like people aren't putting all their money into cars, they put their money into other things like maybe education, maybe they have better like, I don't know, books. I don't know what else people spend their money on if they don't buy cars. Computers. I don't know. But part of it, I think, is really sort of a cultural thing in terms of like, are people spending their time and money on just consuming for just pure, consumptive satisfaction and stuff, or are they looking at sort of that as a productive process where you go out and you say, hey, I want to become a better writer. What is out there? Maybe I get a book on it. Maybe I take a class on it. Maybe there's this planksip thing that is this combination of kind of consuming and producing, which I think is like kind of fascinating. That like I see a lot of like people doing cryptocurrency things, and I'm surprised we haven't talked about that yet, but I will now. And I think one of the promises of cryptocurrency, in terms of not just like as an asset that you can speculate on, but in terms of utility, maybe a way to sort of power some community collaboration pieces where, instead of, I emailed somebody today about this, that maybe if it was possible, instead of making $100,000 a year and spending half of it on, working a job you don't like for $100,000 a year, and then spending half of it on like meaningless, empty consumption, right? Maybe you could just make half of it doing something you really, really love that you felt was like causing, just human flourishing. And I'm not exactly clear that like there's a very great path from one to the other, but I do appreciate that like that could potentially line up with what you're saying, and that if that was successful, maybe GDP goes down and human happiness and satisfaction and things like that could potentially go up. It would be interesting to like do an experiment somewhere. And so I don't know if you've heard of this concept of charter cities, but like people in the left wing tend to hate them. I did when I heard about it.
What, chartered cities?
A charter city, yeah. It's like where you give a government gives over sort of like the authority to run a city to like a private industry. And then it becomes like, okay, I'm going to get this land, I'm going to develop it. And then like the people who move there, you have to like basically sign an agreement with them as to what laws they'll like actually have to follow. And like it's the basic concept is you have to follow the laws of some country. I think murder and anarchy, that's bad for like a for-profit thing generally. So, and also not for profits don't like that either. So like you set up this charter city, and it's like now you have sort of this, a lot of the ideas of like externalities where if you had pollution or things like that, like you wouldn't want that in your charter city because like people don't like that and they might sort of want to move away. It would be bad for their health. They won't be as productive. So like it might be possible to like internalize a lot of the externalities in sort of a charter city type thing. Mm-hmm. And then maybe what you'd find out is that a charter city would actually settle in sort of a range where the GDP is actually lower than you'd expect, because people aren't just like spending a lot of money on like, what'd you call it? Retail therapy. It's a great word.
Yeah. I mean, and that's one dimension, but let me talk about, I think where the climate folks really think we need to go in terms of GDP. So let's use the order of magnitude. And basically that just means times 10, right? So if our GDP is reduced by an order of magnitude, that's what the climate community is saying we need to shift to rather immediately, right? So if that is the case, what do our economies look like? In terms of a GDP production that has reduced from X to 1/10 of X.
So in Canada, X is what, 40,000 a year GDP per capita, something like that.
Oh, the per capita, great. Okay, that helps. Yeah. That makes it a lot easier. I think it's like 58 or something, or 58. I
cool.
think the US is right around 60. And so this is really interesting how much, and there's actually purchasing parity power or something that PPP.
Yeah, purchasing power parity. Yeah.
That's also really important. But the fact is that I'm not going to get into that, but the per capita GDP, which I'm confused about, because if it's just a salary, it's like an average income. So I'm not actually making that connection.
Yeah, it doesn't. Yeah, so it doesn't, like the problem, of course, is that it doesn't reflect any sort of distribution. So as you just take a number, you calculate GDP, the formula they used at use GDP, and you add a bunch of things up, take away some other things, whatever. There's a whole. I took a course in it once.
But it is your gross domestic product. I guess it's what the country actually produces.
Yeah, so it's the things that are produced that have they're in the marketplace kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
So like something like this podcast is not in the marketplace, so it doesn't, to your answer before, it doesn't do anything directly to GDP, maybe indirectly. Yeah. But so you take all of that and then you divide by the number of people and you get like a GDP per capita, which is a number that you compare to different countries and you compare over time, right? So it's sort of, somewhat useful to say like, well, the GDP grew by such and such per year. And then you can correlate it to like, what are the chances of the government getting reelected if the GDP grows by like 7% a year? And I would argue that any place that has the GDP growing by 7% a year, the government's probably getting reelected, because the result of a fast growing GDP is generally more opportunity for people, some other things that politicians like to take responsibility for.
Yeah. Okay, so here we are. Yeah, 43,241 US dollars in 2020, and the US is well. Here, I'll share that. So
yeah. So what would your guess for a country that has a tenth of that?
It'd be devastating. It would be
which country? Like if you were to guess a country, like what do you think? Which country do you think would be like 4,000?
I would say, Africa was a good one. Why don't we say that's our guess to say Africa, right?
What, South Africa?
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking one of the African countries like
Kenya.
Yeah, okay,
Nigeria.
Let's try Kenya.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, Kenya's great.
Yeah, see, like 1,800 versus 40. So it's like 1/32. Okay. So I mean, okay, so they're doing great.
Wow. But look at that
I
graph.
feel bad.
Right?
I shouldn't be laughing like that.
But look at that graph, right?
Yeah.
Really,
we got India, Ghana, and Kenya. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's the growth in GDP that people pay attention to more than the actual level. And so that you can see in Kenya is an amazing story of a fast growing GDP, which translates to a lot of people to, increased opportunity and changes. Like if you compare, what's that, 20 years there? So a generation, so if you go back to around the 2000 mark, what number do you have? Yeah, you have 400 and going up to 1,800, right? So almost 5 times. So if you imagine in 20 years, it goes up 5 times again, it goes from 1,800 to 9,000.
Right.
Right. Now you're talking you get a whole lot of changes in Kenya where, things like people can start to afford cars and all the other sorts of things we know are really important in life and that make, things worth living. But some people say cars are bad. Anyway, yes. But
the point though, Alex, on the other side that I think needs some proper investigation here is that we can't, what the left and the environmentalists are saying, we can't go there. We don't have enough resources to do it and not kill ourselves.
So that's right? Good, because I prefer the discussion to focus on the part that matters, because the GDP is just an abstract measure of something versus the thing that's going to kill us. If you said your house has too much, it has the air in your house is going to kill you. You're oh, I need to get rid of the air. It's well, no, not really. It's the thing in the air, the carbon monoxide or whatever is going to kill you. It's oh, let's focus on that and reduce that and remove it. So the same sort of thing. GDP is not going to kill us directly. It'd be weird if it did. It's just some number. But what is it that will? And it's good. We're going to run out of food or water, or I don't know. Is the air going to be unbreathable?
I mean, okay. So
climate change.
Yeah. Well, the climate change, biodiversity collapse, right? These types of things. Yeah.
So the climate change one's great because it's okay. So there have been all these smart people who've created all these GHG, greenhouse gas, and then they put other things equivalents, and it just becomes super confusing, and then you don't know what to talk about anymore. But I think the basic idea is just that we're trapping too much heat. I think is the idea. The greenhouse sort of concept, I think, is reasonably a sensible analogy. It's like a greenhouse. The light comes in, too much heat stays in. And oh, that's bad. We're going to drive up the average temperature, which, I'm in Toronto and it's December. If you said we're going to drive up the average temperature, I wouldn't be so upset. I'd be that sounds okay to me this time of year. Can you maybe dial it down a bit in the summer? Is this sort of thing? But of course, we also don't know what's going to happen. So it's kind of well, the average temperature is going to go up by a couple degrees, which isn't all that scary. But some places might go up a lot more, some places down. And during times of year, and then certain crops won't grow as well. And the biodiversity part. And then what did you have? Flooding. We talked about that last week.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What basically every sort of bad thing that could potentially happen, climate change just sort of dials up the measure on bad stuff happening. Right?
Yeah. Okay. Well, let me show this graph again, because this is the idea, and I'm trying to just warm each other up to each other's points here, because you said like the rate of increase is the issue here. By the way, did you know that I do a series with Steve Keen?
I think you mentioned it. I don't actually know what Steve Keen does, but I think you'd also mentioned that, so I didn't pay attention.
Yeah, he's a post-Keynesian economist. So we do a series called COVID and Climate Correlations, and we do it every week.
Nice.
I'll maybe put the link in the description, and if I'm not lazy, which I usually am, I might even put it on the video. But basically, what we're seeing here is that increase in GDP, and we've already established that this is actually a good thing for countries in terms of bringing them out of poverty, right? That
is a very good thing for Kenya.
Right. Yes, yeah, it's done wondrous things. And what they're saying is that they want to keep going to be able to bring, and this is Jordan Peterson's point too, right? Because anytime someone from a climate change sort of scenario puts their hand up, he's like, no, it's inconclusive. Quit wasting your time. He's not denying. He's saying, he's pointing exactly to what you're pointing. He's saying, look, the best way to make a difference in the world is to help countries go from this relatively flat sort of thing and have them grow, right? That'll
like a log graph is actually better than what you have there, but I'm sure your post-Keynesian guy knows all kinds of great stuff with like log graphs and awesome things like that. But yeah, I totally agree that it's like there's not necessarily a disagreement as much as it's like a different focus, right? Like folks like me who are like, yeah, we need more growth in the developing countries because that's what's gonna get people out of poverty. Like nothing wrong with charity and stuff like that. And there's a lot of useful charity that's done in the world. But charity doesn't necessarily lead to economic growth directly, and economic growth does lead to things like being able to afford a healthcare system and things like that, right? Like Canada, we have a great healthcare system. Part of it is because we have the GDP to support it, right? If we have the GDP of Kenya, it would be really, really hard to like support our healthcare system. But I do appreciate though that there's this sort of correlation, I think is the word used, between GDP and climate, and like so there's a important work to be done on decoupling those, so that we could have a GDP that like just keeps going up and goes through the roof, and then everybody in the world can live like sort of like the greatest lives ever. And if you look at like Napoleon Bonaparte and like how Napoleon's life was, it was terrible compared to like our lives today. And we are not nearly as powerful and important as Napoleon Bonaparte. You look at the Washington Monument to DC, and it was topped with the most expensive metal at the time, which of course is aluminum, which like you get in like a stupid like can of Coke or whatever, right? Like I love cans of Coke and stuff like that, but like I don't imagine the can as a treasure anymore. And so, you just drink it and you throw it out because mindless consumerism. But like, there's the sense in like these things that were once like super precious and expensive and like, the super uber wealthy, the, very few in the world, like everybody can have at some point. And it's a question of like getting there sort of in a way that's sustainable and healthy. Cause like, there's no sense in like getting everybody out of poverty just so we have a complete. So I don't know if I really disagree with you as much, just say like the focus should be on growing GDP in ways that reduce our sort of climate emissions. If that's kind of the main thing, if it's climate, that's the number one sort of cause of potential bad stuff in the future. I would argue there are other causes, like there's this whole, like I'm involved in this thing called effective altruism, and there's this whole concept of long-termism, and there's like, AI safety is apparently really, really important. I honestly don't understand it at all, other than like the Terminator movies, which everybody tells me that, no, that's not what we're talking about. But then I can't get that out of my head. So like, long-termism is more than, and AI safety is more than that. But there's a sense in which like, there are sort of like contributing factors to this. Like I think people's mental health is probably really, really valuable to focus on, because of all of these things. I think connect back together to it to say the climate can cause worse mental health effects for people, and poor mental health could impact climate negatively, in that if you have bad, poor mental health and you're not getting sort of the supportive relationships and all that, maybe you do engage in retail therapy. And so maybe focusing on mental health as a thing that we actually take seriously instead of just talking about taking seriously.
So we're leaning right into this. I love it. It's funny.
Yeah.
Let me see if I can say.
Yeah.
The way to combat climate change is to spend our way out of it.
Well,
in a way, we're like,
in a way,
I'm having fun with it. It's let's just keep buying.
Well, that's just it, right? Yeah. So if you say like, hey, take all your empty, pointless consumerism that's killing the earth, and spend that on things that are actually meaningful and enriching and empowering, and that's kind of maybe
now you're talking like a liberal, though, right? It's like, what the fuck does that mean?
But maybe that's what we've lost by.
That's why people don't know what to fucking deal with that. Like, what does that mean?
Well, maybe we've lost that by jettisoning things that we traditionally had. Things like community and religion and things like that used to be ways that people would connect with others that didn't require spending money. And we moved those from sort of this like kind of sphere where it wasn't a market-based interaction, right? You don't charge your friends to like hang out with you. Yeah. Right. That would be weird, right? And like you go to church and like there is sort of like a concept of contributing to church and so on and so forth, but it's sort of not designed for like it like probably is better if it's not designed to enrich the church. Like it obviously that happens and that has happened historically, and so like organized religion is a very challenging thing. But if you look at the disorganized religion, like the idea of just like kind of connecting with other people and having sort of like the meaningful conversations and connections, and like people can just have prayer groups over Zoom or what have you or whatever, right? And so like that sort of thing gives people that sense of connection. But it doesn't have to be like an actual like religious thing. It could just be like you have some people you chat with regularly about philosophy, right? Yeah. Or you could have a study group and you're all interested in cryptocurrency or
the thing about it is that there's plenty of that though, right? I mean, the benefits of religion, and this is where Vervecki gets into it a little bit, and so does Peterson. He's saying, we're being premature to jettison these things and then put our faith into other institutions that don't have like overarching virtue ethics or a history, a lineage, like Weinstein would say. And I can kind of tend to agree, but I'm wholeheartedly for a market-driven economy. I'm just saying that the exchange of ideas, and that goes back to ancient Greece, because this is how they exploded as a civilization. It's the cross-fertilization of ideas between the two of us. You might say, what the fuck does that mean? Cross-fertilization. Are we fertilizing what? It smells like shit, right? That's the fertilization.
I love it. I love that metaphor.
But we are exchanging ideas. And what my point is
any kind of ideas, shitty ideas, stupid ideas.
Yes. You know what? Yes. But from that substrate of shit, because we're leaning into the stupidity, something could emerge that was beautiful.
Absolutely. Yes. That's true.
I think we should end it on that. That's
how we solve climate change is more shit. We just need to pile the shit as high as possible.
Yeah, I gotta make my way through that one, but I think that's it. Should we do that? Wrap?
It's a wrap. It's a wrap. Lean into shit and stupidity. There you go.
By Alex and Dan. Yes. Okay. Till next week, Alex. Thank you.
All right. Awesome. Thanks so much.
Bye.
All right.